Right now, you are not eating. Almost nothing else alive can go this long without it. Your stomach has been empty for hours, and your body has not raised a single alarm. A cow chews through most of its waking day, then chews again what it already swallowed. A hummingbird feeds every 10 or 15 minutes through daylight, and still has to shut its own body down at night to survive the gap. A giant panda eats for 12 hours or more, and ends the day barely even. Nearly every animal on Earth is either eating or moving toward the next thing to eat. We are the ones who stopped. No other primate carries a body that can run empty this long and stay this clear while it does. Why does ours? Your jaw is idle right now. The teeth are apart. The muscles along the side of your skull are slack. And unless you are eating something as you listen, they have been that way for most of the hours you have been awake. Across an entire day, a modern human jaw does a surprisingly small amount of work. Researchers who have compared feeding time across primates estimate that people in industrialized societies spend somewhere around half an hour to 40 minutes a day actually chewing. And even in societies that eat far less processed food, the figure tends to stay under an hour and a half. That is a strange thing for a primate body to be doing with its day. A chimpanzee living in the forests of Gombe or Tai spends something closer to 4.5 to 6 hours a day with its jaws in motion, and when researchers tallied it as a share of waking activity, chewing came out near half of everything a chimpanzee does while the sun is up. Half. Sitting in a fig tree, working through fruit after fruit, spitting out wads of fiber that have been ground until nothing more can be pressed from them, then moving to another tree and starting again. The chimpanzee is not doing this because it enjoys chewing. It is doing this because its food is thin, tough, and defended, and the only machinery it has for opening that food is the machinery in its mouth. Ripe fruit sounds generous until you look at what forest fruit actually is. A skin, a knot of fiber, seeds, and a modest smear of sugar spread through material that resists being broken. Figs in particular have to be worked over and over, and much of what a chimpanzee chews never gets swallowed at all. It gets pressed dry and dropped. Add the leaves and the pith taken during lean months, when fruit is scarce, and the animal falls back on stems that are almost pure structural fiber, and the chewing hours climb rather than fall. There is no shortcut available to that animal. Every calorie that enters its body passes first through a set of teeth working under a set of muscles, and the time cost of that passage is paid in daylight. Now hold your own morning next to that. Whatever you ate, it likely required a few minutes of work at the front end and then disappeared. The difference is not a small refinement in habit. It is somewhere between a 5-fold and a 10-fold collapse in the amount of time a body spends processing its own food, and it happened in a lineage that started out chewing like every other ape. Something in the human line gave up the ape's schedule, and the equipment for that schedule went with it. Look at what a chimpanzee's skull carries in order to chew for 5 hours. The temporalis muscle, the one you can feel tighten at your temple when you clench, runs up the side of a chimpanzee's brain case as a broad sheet anchored across a much larger area than yours. In gorillas and in many of our extinct relatives, the muscle grew so large that the skull had to sprout a bony ridge along the midline simply to give it somewhere to attach. Your skull has no such ridge, and it has no need of one. The masseter, the slab along your cheek, is proportionally smaller than a chimpanzee's. Your molars are smaller. The whole tooth row is shorter, tucked under a face that has retracted backward under the brain case, rather than pushing forward into a muzzle. Bite force follows the hardware down. There is also a specific and much discussed piece of evidence buried in the human genome. Other primates carry a working version of a gene called MYH16, which produces a form of myosin used in the powerful jaw-closing muscles. In humans, that gene is broken. A small deletion knocked it out of service, so the muscle fibers it once built are simply not built. Researchers who first described this estimated the deletion arose roughly 2.5 million years ago and proposed that losing the heavy jaw musculature removed a mechanical constraint on the growing brain case. That interpretation has been argued over ever since, both the dating and the causal claim, and the honest position is that we do not know whether the broken gene was a cause, a consequence, or a coincidence sitting near the real story. What is not in dispute is the direction of travel. The human chewing apparatus shrank, and it shrank in a lineage whose brain was doing the opposite. So the hours had to go somewhere, and they did not simply become leisure. Time in a wild body is not free time. It is energy accounting. A chimpanzee chewing for 5 hours is a chimpanzee that is not traveling, not resting, not doing much of anything else. And it is also a chimpanzee spending energy on the act of chewing itself, which is not nothing when repeated for a lifetime. Every hour recovered from the mouth is an hour that becomes available for something a body could not otherwise afford. Some of it went into movement. Human ranging distances are large for a primate. Some of it went into the long, expensive business of raising offspring who stay dependent far past the age at which a young chimpanzee is feeding itself. And a considerable share of the recovered energy, the evidence suggests, went into tissue that consumes fuel at a rate almost nothing else in the body can match. Your brain is roughly 2% of your mass and takes something on the order of 1/5 of your resting energy. That organ does not run on spare capacity. It runs on a budget that had to be taken from somewhere, and reducing the cost of processing food is one of the few places in a primate body where that much can be found. There is a cost written into the modern skull as well, and you may be carrying it. A jaw that is no longer loaded with hours of hard chewing during growth does not develop quite the same way. The evidence suggests that mechanical loading during childhood contributes to how wide and how long the jaw becomes. Modern human jaws are, on average, smaller than the jaws found in the same populations a few thousand years ago, while the teeth themselves have not shrunk to match at the same rate. The result is the familiar crowded arrangement teeth rotated, overlapping, third molars that arrive to find no room and press sideways into the bone. Impacted wisdom teeth are close to unknown in wild chimpanzees, which have jaws long enough to seat the whole tooth row comfortably. That mismatch is one of the quiet prices of the trade, a piece of ape equipment installed in a jaw that was designed under different loads. There is another price, harder to see, and it is a matter of what your body now assumes about the world. A chimpanzee's chewing schedule is also a chimpanzee's eating schedule. The animal is nearly always processing, which means it is nearly always taking in a trickle of energy. Feeding is spread across the whole light half of the day in small continuous installments. When the human mouth stopped needing hours, human eating collapsed into episodes of few concentrated events separated by long stretches of nothing. That is not a minor scheduling change. It means the body between those events has to run on something other than what is currently arriving through the mouth, and that requires storage, release, and a set of controls to manage both. The interval that feels ordinary to you, the perfectly unremarkable gap between lunch and dinner during which you continue to think clearly and move normally, is an interval most primates never experience while awake. So the first thing to notice about the human relationship with food is that it began at the front, in the mouth, with an ape that stopped needing to chew, and that this change alone bought a great deal of time. What it does not explain is how the body survived the emptiness that came with it. Removing hours from the mouth does not remove the requirement for fuel. Something further down had to change too, and here the anatomy becomes stranger than the skull. A chimpanzee's chewing is only the first stage of a long process. What it swallows is still largely intact fiber, and the real extraction happens deeper, in a chamber built for slow work that human bodies do not have at anything like the same scale. The gut of a great ape is not a scaled-down version of ours or a scaled-up one. It is a different shape entirely, weighted toward a different section, and the section that dominates in a chimpanzee is the section that has quietly diminished in you. Where that missing capacity went, and what was purchased with the energy it stopped consuming, is where the shape of this whole question begins to come clear. Lay a hand flat against your stomach and press in gently. Under the skin and the sheet of muscle, there is a compartment that, for an animal of your size, is unusually modest. Your torso is narrow at the waist, and the rib cage above it tapers inward rather than flaring out to make room for what sits below. That shape is so ordinary to us that it takes another ape standing beside it to reveal how odd it is. A silverback gorilla weighs somewhere between 160 and 200 kilograms in the wild, and the most recognizable thing about his outline is the belly. It pushes forward past the chest, wide and low and solid, and the rib cage above it flares outward to accommodate it. That belly is not fat. A wild mountain gorilla carries very little fat. What fills that space is a digestive system built on a scale that has no equivalent in your body, and, specifically, it is a fermentation chamber, a colon so enlarged that in a great ape it can account for more than half of the entire volume of the gut. The gorilla needs it because of what it eats. In the Virungas, a mountain gorilla lives on leaves, stems, pith, bark, wild celery, bamboo shoots, and nettles, and the defining feature of that diet is that most of its bulk is cellulose. No mammal on Earth produces an enzyme that can break cellulose. Not the gorilla, not you, not a cow, not an elephant. The molecule is simply beyond the chemistry that vertebrate bodies build. What a gorilla does instead is house an enormous population of bacteria in that expanded colon and let them do the work, and the bacteria return the favor by releasing short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, butyrate, which the gorilla absorbs straight through the colon wall and burns as fuel. Researchers who have measured this suggest fermentation supplies a large fraction of a gorilla's daily energy, with some estimates placing it above half. The animal is, in a real sense, not living on leaves at all. It is living on what bacteria make out of leaves. That arrangement works, and it has worked for a very long time, and the price of it is time. Fermentation is slow. Studies of passage rates in great apes find that material can remain in the system for well over a day, sometimes considerably longer, and the chamber only functions if it stays loaded. A silverback processes something on the order of 18 to 30 kilograms of vegetation in a day, and observers who follow mountain gorillas find that feeding occupies roughly half of the daylight hours, broken up by rest periods during which the fermentation continues without him. He cannot skip a day. He cannot skip most of an afternoon. The microbial population inside him requires a steady supply of substrate, and a gut that empties is a gut whose workforce begins to starve. The gorilla's continuous eating schedule is not a behavioral preference or a matter of appetite. It is a maintenance requirement for an organ the size of a duffel bag. Your gut is arranged along a completely different logic. In humans, the small intestine dominates. Researchers who have measured gut proportions across primates find that the small intestine accounts for well over half of total human gut volume, while the colon takes somewhere near a fifth. In a gorilla or a chimpanzee, those proportions are close to reversed. The small intestine is not a fermentation chamber. It is an absorption surface, lined with villi and microvilli, designed to pull apart and take up material that has already been reduced to something usable: sugars, amino acids, fats. It is fast, it is efficient, and it is useless on a leaf. There is a further measurement that makes the divergence concrete. When researchers compared the total mass of the human digestive tract against what would be predicted for a primate of our body size, the human gut came out at roughly 60% of the expected figure. Nearly half the organ gone. This is the observation behind one of the most cited ideas in human evolution, put forward by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in the mid-1990s. Their reasoning began with a puzzle about heat and fuel. The human brain consumes energy at an extraordinary rate for its mass, and yet the human resting metabolic rate is unremarkable for a mammal of our size. The total bill did not go up. So if the brain grew far beyond ape proportions without raising the overall cost of running the body, something else must have been reduced by a comparable amount. And gut tissue is one of the very few candidates gram for gram. The digestive tract is metabolically expensive in the same league as brain tissue. A shrinking gut and an expanding brain, they proposed, were two halves of a single transaction. That idea is elegant. It fits the anatomy, and it has been argued over vigorously ever since. When later researchers tested the relationship across a broad sample of mammals, they did not find the clean inverse correlation between brain size and gut size that the hypothesis predicts, and they proposed other sources for the energy fat storage, help with raising offspring, or simply a body that takes in and spends more overall. Measurements of daily energy expenditure in humans and other apes point in that last direction. Humans appear to burn meaningfully more energy per day than chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangutans of comparable size, which suggests the brain may have been funded less by a trade and more by an expansion of the whole budget. We do not actually know which account is correct, or whether both are partly true. What is not in question is the anatomy itself. The chamber shrank. Whatever else happened, the human body stopped carrying the equipment for slow extraction from poor material. The cost of that is immediate and total, and it is easy to demonstrate. Put a person on a gorilla's diet and they will starve. Not slowly, and not because the food is unpleasant. They will starve with a full stomach, because the leaves and stems will pass through a system that has no chamber capable of unlocking them, and what comes out the far end will carry most of the energy that went in. A gorilla can survive a season when nothing rich is available anywhere in the forest by simply eating more of what is worthless. That option was removed from our lineage. Everything a human body runs on has to arrive already dense: fat, sugar, starch, protein, or arrive in a form that something outside the body has already broken open. The small gut is not a small gut with the same capabilities. It is a specialist organ that assumes its input will be high in quality, and it has no fallback if that assumption fails. A trace of the old machinery does survive in you, and it is worth knowing where. Your colon still ferments. The bacteria living there still work on the fiber that the small intestine could not handle. and they still release short-chain fatty acids across the colon wall. Though the quantities are modest estimates for the share of human energy obtained this way, generally sit in the single digits rather than anything close to a gorilla's. One detail stands out. Butyrate, one of the acids those bacteria produce, is the preferred fuel of the cells lining the colon itself. Those cells feed directly on what the microbes make ahead of the rest of the body, which means the last remnant of the ape fermentation chamber is largely in the business of maintaining itself. It is a working organ reduced to a caretaker of its own lining, plus a small contribution to the household. So the second thing to notice is that the trade did not stop at the mouth. The reduction ran all the way through smaller teeth, shorter jaw, weaker bite, and then a digestive tract with its center of gravity moved from the slow chamber to the fast-absorbing tube. Together, those changes bought an enormous amount of time and, quite possibly, funded the most expensive organ any primate has ever carried. They also created the exact problem this whole question circles around. A gorilla is never empty. His system is loaded at all times with material in various stages of breakdown, which means energy is trickling into his bloodstream continuously, hour after hour, whether he is feeding at that moment or resting in the undergrowth. A fast gut does the opposite. Dense food in a small, efficient tract is absorbed and finished with quickly, and then there is nothing left in the system at all. The very efficiency that made the human gut affordable is what produces the emptiness, the hours when nothing is arriving and nothing is left in transit. Something has to cover that gap, and it cannot be the gut, because the gut is precisely what was given up. The body needs a reservoir it can draw on when the tube is quiet, filled during the good hours and emptied during the long ones. And there is a great ape that shows exactly what such a reservoir looks like when a forest stops producing food for months at a time. Where that ape keeps its reserve, and how much more of it a human being carries, even at a perfectly ordinary weight, is the next thing worth looking at. Some part of what is keeping you alive at this moment did not come from your last meal. Hours after eating, with the small intestine finished and quiet, a portion of the fuel moving through your bloodstream is being released from your own tissue, fatty acids leaving storage cells, drifting out into circulation, taken up by muscle and liver, and burned. The process is silent, and you cannot feel it happening, which is precisely why it deserves attention. Your body has a reservoir. It is drawing on it right now, and the reason that reservoir exists is that a human body has to expect emptiness. There is an ape that shows what such a reservoir is for, and it lives in a forest that has made a habit of failing. On Borneo and Sumatra, the dominant trees across enormous stretches of lowland forest belong to a family called the dipterocarps, and they do something that shapes every animal beneath them. Rather than fruiting on an annual cycle, they synchronize. Across whole regions, the trees flower and fruit together in a single overwhelming episode, then stop, and the interval before the next one is unpredictable, sometimes 2 years, sometimes closer to 7 or 8, apparently triggered by climatic signals the trees respond to in concert. When a massed event arrives, the forest floods with fruit far faster than the animals living there can consume it. Between events, the same forest offers very little. An orangutan lives its entire life inside that rhythm. Researchers working at Gunung Palung in West Kalimantan followed wild orangutans across both conditions and estimated their daily calorie intake in each, and the gap they found is difficult to hold in the mind. During a fruit mast, the animals ate enormous quantities, with estimates for large males running to several thousand calories a day and beyond. During the long lean stretches, intake fell to a fraction of that, in some measurements to under half, in others considerably worse. The food available in those periods is bark, leaves, and cambium, the soft living layer stripped from beneath tree bark, which is exactly the sort of material a great ape gut can extract something from. Slowly, at a poor rate of return, the animals are not starving in the sense of wasting away. They are running a deficit for months, and they are covering that deficit from somewhere. The researchers established where by testing urine. During the lean periods, they found ketones, the compounds a body produces when it is breaking down fat at scale, and their presence in that setting is a direct signature of an animal living off its own reserve. During the mast, the ketones vanished and the animals put weight back on. An orangutan, in other words, spends the good years filling a tank and the bad years emptying it, and the cycle it is riding out is measured in seasons rather than hours. There is a second half to how that animal survives, which is that it is remarkably cheap to run. When researchers measured daily energy expenditure in orangutans using doubly labeled water, the figures came back among the lowest recorded for any mammal of comparable size. A body that moves slowly, deliberately, and rarely wastes a motion, mounted on a metabolism turned down to a setting that gives the reserve as long as possible to last. Slow growth, long intervals between births, and an unhurried way of moving through the canopy all belong to the same strategy. The orangutan solved the problem of an unreliable forest by becoming an animal that needs less and stores more. Now set your own body against that, because the striking thing is not that you also store fat, it is how much. Measurements of wild great apes generally find body fat in the low single digits to under 10% for healthy adults, with wild males often at the extreme low end of that range. A healthy human adult, by contrast, typically carries somewhere between roughly 15 and 30%, depending on sex and individual variation, and the figure for a perfectly fit person is still well above what a wild chimpanzee or gorilla carries. We are, by a wide margin, the fattest primate, and we are fat in a way that is not a sign of anything having gone wrong. The most revealing evidence is not in adults at all. A human newborn arrives with roughly 15% of its body mass as fat, and over the following months, that proportion climbs higher still. Researchers who have looked for comparable figures in other primates find newborns in the range of 2 to 4%. A human infant is born, padded in a way no other primate infant is, and among terrestrial mammals, generally it stands near the top of the list. Nothing about that is accidental. Being born already stocked is expensive for the mother and offers no advantage in movement or warmth that would justify the cost on its own, which points toward the reserve itself being the point of supply attached to an infant whose brain is growing at a rate that consumes an extraordinary share of everything the child takes in, and which cannot be permitted to run short even briefly. The most fuel-hungry organ in the human line arrives with its own dedicated buffer, installed before birth. The reason a body would choose fat for this, rather than anything else, comes down to physics. Fat stores roughly 9 calories per gram and stores them dry. Glycogen, the other option, holds about 4 calories per gram and binds water alongside it, several grams of water for every gram of glycogen, which makes it heavy out of all proportion to what it delivers. A human adult carries a total glycogen store liver plus muscle that amounts to something on the order of a day's energy at most, and the liver's share, the part available to supply the brain, runs down far faster than that. The fat on the same body is a different order of magnitude entirely. Even a lean adult carries reserves that, in pure energetic terms, would cover weeks. That asymmetry is the whole architecture of the human day. The fast, quiet gut described a moment ago hands over dense fuel in a short burst and then goes idle, and what covers the following hours is a tank measured in weeks rather than a tank measured in hours. Fat also turned out to be more than a warehouse. Adipose tissue releases a hormone called leptin, roughly in proportion to how much of it there is, and the brain reads that signal as a running report on the size of the reserve. When the reserve falls, the signal weakens, and a set of systems respond: appetite, energy expenditure, and reproductive function among them. A body that can measure its own reserve can also make decisions on the basis of it, including decisions about whether conditions are good enough to bear a child. The reservoir is wired to the brain, and the brain treats its level as information about the world outside. There is a cost written into all of this, and it is not the obvious one. The system was assembled under the assumption that filling opportunities would be rare and emptying periods would be certain, which means the machinery for storing is built to act quickly and generously whenever dense food appears, while the machinery for releasing is comparatively cautious and slow to concede that the reserve should be spent. That asymmetry is an advantage in a forest that fails for years at a time. In an environment where the filling opportunity arrives 3 times a day and never stops arriving, the same asymmetry produces a body that keeps preparing for a scarcity that does not come. The evidence on how that plays out across different populations and different environments is complicated, and it would be dishonest to compress it into a single clean explanation. What can be said plainly is that the tank was designed around a gap, and the gap was expected to be much longer than the one between lunch and dinner. So the reservoir is the answer to the question the shrinking gut created. The mouth stopped needing hours. The digestive chamber shrank away. Dense food began passing through a fast tube that finished with it quickly, and the emptiness that followed is covered by a store of fuel large enough that its owner never has to think about it. That is why the interval feels like nothing. You are not enduring a fast between meals. You are drawing on a supply that was filled hours or days ago, using a system that an orangutan runs on the scale of years, and that you run on the scale of an afternoon. What the reservoir does not explain is who is permitted to have one. Storage sounds like a solution available to any animal willing to carry the weight, and it is not. There is a hard physical limit on which bodies can survive on stored fuel at all, and it has nothing to do with willingness or with diet. It has to do with size, and specifically with the relationship between how much surface a body has and how much volume sits behind that surface. Below a certain point on that scale, no reserve is ever large enough, because the rate at which the animal burns through it outruns anything it could realistically carry. There are mammals for which a gap of a few hours is not an inconvenience but a lethal event, and they are not rare or exotic animals. They are living in the walls of buildings and under the floors of barns across most of the world, and understanding why they cannot do what you are doing right now reveals the first condition that had to be met before any of this became possible. You are warm right now, and keeping you that way is costing something. Under the blanket, in a dark room, your body is holding an internal temperature near 37 degrees against a world that is cooler than that, and the heat leaking out through your skin every second has to be replaced every second by chemistry running inside you. That expense continues whether you eat or not. It does not pause overnight. It does not scale down because the stomach is empty, and it is one of the largest single items in the account of what a resting human body spends. Yet you can go a whole night and most of a following morning without adding anything to the account and stay warm the entire time. Whether an animal can do that turns out to depend less on what it eats than on how big it is, and the reason is a piece of geometry that no living thing has found a way around. Take any shape and double it in every direction. The surface grows by a factor of 4. The volume grows by a factor of 8. Surface and volume do not keep pace with each other, and since heat is generated throughout a volume and lost across a surface, every reduction in body size means proportionally more skin wrapped around proportionally less interior. A small warm-blooded animal is, in effect, all surface. It bleeds heat at a rate that a large animal never has to contend with, and the only way to remain warm is to burn harder. This shows up in one of the most reliable relationships in all of biology. When metabolic rate is plotted against body mass across mammals, the total rate rises with size, but it rises more slowly than mass itself, approximately with mass raised to the 3/4 power, a pattern usually named after Max Kleiber, who described it in the 1930s. The consequence, once the arithmetic is turned around, is that each gram of a small animal is far more expensive to run than each gram of a large one. A gram of mouse burns something on the order of 10 to 20 times what a gram of human burns. The mouse is not living a faster life as a matter of temperament. Every cell it owns is being pushed at a rate yours never approaches. Everything about the animal follows from that. A house mouse weighs somewhere around 20 grams and runs a heart at roughly 500 to 700 beats a minute, in some conditions higher, a rate at which the individual beats stop being countable by ear and become a hum. It breathes several times a second. It eats, across a night, something in the region of 1/6 of its own body weight, taken in a long series of small bouts, rather than in meals, a few seconds of feeding, a pause, a return, repeated through the dark hours until light comes. There is no equivalent in that animal's life of the gap you are currently sitting in, and a mouse is not the extreme. Shrews are the extreme. The Etruscan shrew weighs under 2 grams, which is less than a small coin, and reported heart rates for the species run to figures over 1,000 beats per minute numbers, so far outside ordinary mammalian experience that they were difficult to measure at all until the instruments improved. A shrew of that size must consume something in the range of its own body weight in food each day, sometimes more, and deprived of food, it does not weaken over days the way a larger mammal does. It dies in hours. Several hours of emptiness, for that body, is not hunger. It is a terminal event, and shrews hunt through the night and through the day in alternating short shifts because the alternative is not available to them. Now put the reservoir from a moment ago next to that animal and watch it fail. A mouse does store fat, and proportionally the store is not absurd. A well-fed mouse might carry a few % of its mass as adipose tissue. The problem is that a few % of 20 grams is under a gram, and a gram of fat holds roughly 9 calories against a daily expenditure that for an animal of that size and activity level runs to something over 10. The tank is smaller than a single day's spending. Scale that same calculation up to a human being, and the result is barely recognizable as the same kind of measurement. A lean adult carries fat reserves that, in pure energetic terms, would cover weeks of resting expenditure, and a person of ordinary build carries considerably more than that. The difference is not that humans are unusually good at storing. The difference is the ratio between what a body can hold and what a body burns, and those two quantities scale differently. Storage rises roughly in step with mass, while the rate of burning rises more slowly, which means the length of time a reserve can last stretches out as animals get larger. Researchers refer to this as fasting endurance, and it explains something that is otherwise puzzling about the distribution of life on Earth. Hibernation, migration over long distances without feeding, tolerance of seasonal famine, these are options that open up to bodies above a certain size and stay closed to bodies below it, regardless of how clever or careful the animal is. The small mammal is not doing something wrong. It is running against a wall built out of geometry. Some small mammals do find a workaround, and it involves surrendering the very thing the warmth at the start of this was describing, letting the internal temperature fall and the metabolism drop toward the surroundings, which is a real solution used by real animals under real pressure, and one that comes with a distinct set of costs worth returning to later. What matters here is that the workaround exists precisely because the direct route is closed. Nothing that small can simply carry enough. So the first condition that had to be satisfied before a body could stop eating all day was mass. Not diet, not intelligence, not any refinement of the gut mass. A body at human scale loses heat slowly enough, burns at a low enough rate per gram, and holds enough absolute volume of stored fuel that the hours between meals become survivable without any special adaptation at all. The reduced chewing time, the shrunken fermentation chamber, the oversized fat reserve, none of those would have been survivable strategies in a 2-gram body. They became available only once the animal carrying them was large. And there is a version of the mouse's predicament that every human being has personally lived through which is worth sitting with. A newborn is small. Not shrew small, but small enough that the same geometry applies with real force. A large surface relative to volume, heat lost quickly, and a mass-specific metabolic rate roughly twice an adult's. On top of that ordinary cost sits the most expensive brain in the primate world, growing at its fastest rate, taking a share of the infant's total energy that researchers have estimated to be extraordinary in early childhood. By some measurements, the majority of resting energy expenditure goes to the brain alone. Set against that, the infant's fat reserve, generous though it is by primate standards, buys hours rather than days. The result is the schedule every parent knows: feeding every 2 to 3 hours, through the night, without exception, for months. That is a mouse's relationship with food, running inside a human household, and it does not end because the child learns patience. It ends because the child gets bigger. The freedom you're exercising at this moment was not granted to you at birth. It arrived with mass, gradually, over years. There is a cost hidden in the arrangement, and it is the cost of everything described so far being conditional. A large body that can fast is also a large body that requires a great deal of absolute fuel each day, and the reserve that makes the gap comfortable has to be filled from somewhere. Continuous nibbling will not do it. A mouse can meet its needs in small mouthfuls spread across a night because its needs, in absolute terms, are tiny. A body that spends thousands of calories a day and eats only 3 times cannot work that way. It has to be capable of taking in an enormous quantity in a short window and holding it, which is a different problem entirely from being able to survive on stored fuel afterward. Being big enough to wait is one thing. Being able to eat like an animal that waits is another, and it needs equipment, a stomach that can expand far past its resting size without distress, a chemistry aggressive enough to begin breaking down a large, dense load quickly, and a nervous system comfortable with a whole cycle of gorging and then doing nothing for a long stretch. That combination is uncommon among primates and unremarkable among predators, and there is an animal asleep in millions of homes tonight whose digestive tract is built around exactly this pattern, and whose stomach acid is closer to yours than a fruit-eating ape's is. What that similarity implies about the human line is not comfortable, and it is difficult to explain any other way. There is a particular heaviness that follows a large meal, and most people read it as simple fullness. What is actually happening is more specific. The upper part of your stomach has relaxed actively, under nervous control, through a reflex that lets the walls slacken as food arrives, so that a large volume can enter without the internal pressure climbing much at all. An empty human stomach holds something close to 50 milliliters. A comfortably full one holds around a liter, and the organ can be pushed considerably beyond that. That expansion is not passive stretching of a bag. It is a coordinated relaxation that has to be triggered, and its existence says something plain about what the human stomach expects to receive. Not a trickle, but an arrival. An animal that grazes has little use for such a mechanism. An animal that eats in episodes cannot function without one. The clearest working example of episodic feeding is asleep in a great many homes tonight. A dog's ancestors ran a feeding pattern that biologists sometimes describe as gorge and fast, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A wolf that brings down a large prey animal may take in something on the order of 9 kilograms of meat in a single session, which for a wolf is close to a fifth of its own body weight, and then go days without another meal. Field observations of wolves in Yellowstone and in the boreal forests of Canada find long intervals between kills, sometimes stretching past a week, with the animals traveling and hunting through the gap on nothing. The domestic dog inherited the equipment for that life, even though the life itself is gone. A dog's stomach is proportionally large and highly distensible, capable of accommodating a meal that would be alarming in an animal of similar size that grazed. The intestine behind it is short. A dog's digestive tract, measured against its body length, is a fraction of what a comparable herbivore carries, because there is no fermentation work to do. Meat requires no chamber and no waiting. It requires enzymes and acid, and it delivers its energy quickly. The transit time through a dog is measured in hours, where a gorilla's is measured in days. That whole design solves the problem that a wolf faces, which is not how to extract energy from poor material, but how to take on an enormous quantity of good material in a short window and hold it. The acid is the part worth slowing down over. A dog's stomach maintains a pH that hovers near 1 during digestion, which is aggressively acidic, and the reason is not primarily about breaking down protein. Pepsin, the main protein-cutting enzyme in the stomach, works well in acid, but it does not require anything that extreme. The extremity is doing something else. When a team of researchers compared stomach acidity across a broad sample of birds and mammals, sorting the species by what they ate, a pattern emerged that had little to do with how difficult the food was to digest. The most acidic stomachs did not belong to the animals eating the toughest material. They belong to the scavengers, the animals whose food is likely to have been dead for some time before it is eaten, and therefore likely to be carrying a substantial load of bacteria. Vultures sit near the extreme. The acid, on that reading, is a barrier. It is a chemical filter standing between an animal's food and its intestine, and the strength of the filter tracks how contaminated the food is expected to be, rather than how tough it is. Human stomach acidity, in that same comparison, came out near a pH of 1.5. That figure places us well away from the fruit-eating primates, and much nearer the scavenging end of the distribution, more acidic than would be predicted for an ape living on figs and leaves, and closer to what is found in animals that routinely eat things other animals killed. The interpretation offered was that our lineage passed through a period in which food carrying a serious microbial load was a regular part of the diet, whether through scavenging carcasses, storing food for later, or both. It should be said clearly that this is an inference drawn from a pattern across species, not a direct observation of what anyone ate 2 million years ago, and other explanations for a strong acid barrier have been proposed. What is not inferred is the measurement itself. The acid in you right now is stronger than a fruit-eating ape's, and something in the history of this lineage made that worth paying for. The parallel with the dog goes further than acid into the timing of the whole cycle. A dog that has eaten heavily becomes still. Blood flow shifts toward the digestive tract. The animal settles, and activity drops for a stretch afterward. That same shift happens in you, and it is a large part of what the heaviness after a big meal actually is, a redirection of circulation toward the gut and a set of hormonal signals, including cholecystokinin, released as fat and protein reach the small intestine, which act on the nervous system and reduce the drive to do anything at all. The drowsiness is not weakness or poor discipline. It is the designed second half of an episodic feeding cycle, the rest phase that follows the intake phase, and it exists in animals that eat in bouts and is largely absent in animals that eat continuously. A cow does not lie down overwhelmed after a mouthful, because a cow never takes on a load large enough to require it. Where the human body diverges from the dog is in what it does with the fuel once the load is aboard, and this is where the trade described earlier starts paying out. A dog gorges and then coasts on what it took in, and when that is gone, it must find more. A human gorges, absorbs quickly through that fast small intestine, and then does something no wolf does especially well. It converts a large share of the surplus into long-term storage and continues functioning at full mental capacity long after the last of the meal has cleared. The gorge and fast pattern in our line is not a hunting adaptation running on a hunting schedule. It is the same intake machinery attached to a reservoir, and the combination produces an animal that can eat like a predator and then wait like nothing else its size. The costs of this arrangement are real, and most people have felt at least one of them. A stomach lined against acid of that strength depends entirely on its defenses, holding a layer of mucus, a bicarbonate buffer beneath it, and a rate of cell replacement in the lining that is among the fastest anywhere in the body, with the surface epithelium turning over in a matter of days. When that barrier is compromised, the acid is perfectly capable of digesting the wall that contains it. The junction at the top, where the esophagus meets the stomach, was never engineered for an upright animal that lies down flat a few hours after a large evening meal, and the burning sensation that follows is acid arriving somewhere with no mucus defense at all. There is also a deeper vulnerability, which is dependence. The dog's short gut and the human's small one are both specialist arrangements that assume dense, high-quality input. Strip that assumption away and neither animal has a fallback, because the fallback organ was surrendered generations ago. So the picture now has most of its parts: a mouth that stopped needing hours, a gut that shed its slow chamber, a reservoir large enough to cover the gap, a body mass sufficient to make the gap survivable, and a stomach built to take on a large, dense load in a single event, and then close for business. Together, those changes account for a body that can go without food from one evening to the following midday without difficulty. They do not account for the thing that is actually strange about it, Going without food is one problem. Going without food, while continuing to think clearly, is a different problem, and it is far harder, because the organ that makes human beings unusual is also the organ least tolerant of interruption. The brain runs almost entirely on glucose under ordinary conditions and cannot store meaningful amounts of anything. The liver's supply of glycogen, the reserve specifically available to keep blood sugar steady, is modest enough for a matter of hours rather than days, and largely spent by morning after a night's sleep. Fat cannot cross into the brain in its ordinary form. By every straightforward reading of that arithmetic, a human being who has not eaten since the previous evening should be confused and failing by the middle of the following day, and that is not what happens. Something is being delivered to the brain that is neither glucose from a meal nor glucose from the liver, and the machinery that makes it runs quietly in the background of every long gap anyone has ever gone through. That machinery is not a human invention. It reaches its most extreme expression in an animal that spends a third of the year sealed underground, eating nothing, drinking nothing, and emerging in spring with its muscle largely intact and its brain in working order, which is a feat that ought to be impossible, and is not. In the last weeks of autumn, a black bear in the mountains of Montana or Ontario does something that looks like a disorder. It eats without pause, working through berries and nuts and whatever else the season has left. And researchers who have estimated intake during this period put the figure as high as 20,000 calories in a day, taken on by an animal that will shortly stop eating altogether. The wait goes on fast. Then, when the cold settles, the bear enters a den, and everything reverses. Over the following 5 to 7 months, it eats nothing, it drinks nothing, it does not urinate or defecate. Its heart rate falls from something near 50 beats a minute to figures in the single digits, with long pauses between beats, and its metabolic rate drops to a fraction of normal. What it does not do is let its core temperature collapse. Unlike a ground squirrel, which lets its body fall to within a few degrees of freezing, a denning bear holds its interior somewhere around 30 to 35 degrees cooler than summer, but warm enough that the animal can be roused, and warm enough that a female can give birth in the den and nurse cubs through the remainder of the winter without ever leaving to feed. A body that warm, for that long, on no fuel arriving, is running an enormous bill against a closed account. The animal emerges in spring thin but functional, and the part that ought to be impossible is that it emerges with its muscle largely intact. A human being confined to a bed for 5 months without moving loses a great deal of muscle, and a human being starved for 5 months would have consumed a devastating share of their own protein simply to keep blood sugar from failing. The bear does neither. Studies measuring muscle protein in hibernating bears find losses far smaller than the period of inactivity and fasting would predict, and part of the explanation appears to be a recycling trick. The bear does not excrete urea, the nitrogen-carrying waste product of protein breakdown, and instead breaks it down and returns the nitrogen to building new protein, a process the evidence suggests involves the microbial population in its gut. The animal is repairing itself out of its own waste. Underneath all of it sits the arrangement that matters most for the question at hand, which is what the bear's brain is running on through those months, and the answer is not sugar. Almost the entire energy supply of a hibernating bear comes from fat, and fat presents a specific problem when the organ that needs feeding is a brain. Fatty acids circulating in the blood do not cross into brain tissue in useful quantities. The barrier separating the brain circulation from the rest of the body is selective about what it admits, and long-chain fatty acids are largely excluded, which means that a body sitting on an enormous reserve of fat cannot simply hand that reserve to the organ with the largest appetite. Something has to convert it into a form the barrier will accept. That conversion happens in the liver. When fatty acids arrive there in quantity and there is little carbohydrate to work alongside them, the liver takes the fragments produced by breaking those fats apart and, instead of burning them all locally, assembles them into small water-soluble molecules, beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and a small amount of acetone. These are the ketone bodies, and the essential thing about them is that they dissolve in blood, travel freely, and are carried across into brain tissue by dedicated transporters. The liver becomes a translator. It takes a fuel the brain cannot use and issues it in a currency the brain accepts. Everything else in this arrangement follows from that single chemical step. Now the reason for lingering on a Denning bear becomes clear, because you were doing a modest version of the same thing this morning before you ate anything, and you have done it every night of your life. The arithmetic left over from a moment ago has an answer. Liver glycogen amounts to something on the order of 100 grams in an adult, roughly 400 calories, and it is the only glycogen store that can supply the bloodstream. Because muscle glycogen lacks the enzyme required to release glucose back out into circulation, muscle keeps its reserve strictly for itself. That liver store is substantially drawn down by morning after a night's sleep. Meanwhile, the brain continues asking for its share, which is not a small share. Under those conditions, two things begin at once. The liver starts manufacturing new glucose from other materials, from glycerol released as fat breaks apart, from lactate, from amino acids, and it begins producing ketones. Blood levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate in a person who has not eaten overnight are already measurably elevated above the level after a meal, and they climb further through a longer gap. By the time a person has gone a full day without food, the brain is drawing a meaningful portion of its fuel from ketones rather than glucose. In the classic fasting studies carried out in the 1960s, most closely associated with George Cahill, subjects fasting for weeks were found to be running their brains predominantly on ketone bodies, with glucose reduced to a minority contribution. The brain never abandons glucose entirely. Certain cells and certain processes require it, and the liver keeps producing a baseline supply, but the majority of the load shifts. The purpose of the shift is not merely to keep the lights on, it is to protect the body from itself. If ketones did not exist, the only way to supply a brain during a long gap would be to manufacture glucose continuously, and the main raw material for that manufacture is amino acids, which means muscle. A body without a ketone system would be obliged to dismantle its own structural protein to feed its head, and it would do so at a rate that becomes dangerous within days. Researchers describe ketones as protein sparing, which is an accurate and rather dry way of naming something quite drastic. This pathway is the reason a person can miss a day of eating and lose almost nothing that matters, and it is the reason a bear comes out of a den in spring still able to walk and hunt. It is also, plainly, the mechanism that makes the entire human feeding pattern viable. Every element assembled so far, the reduced chewing, the shrunken fermentation chamber, the enormous fat reserve, the body mass, the stomach built for episodes, produces an animal that carries its energy as fat and eats in widely spaced events. None of that would be survivable in a creature whose brain could only run on sugar, because the sugar would run out long before the next meal and the body would have to cannibalize itself to make more. The liver's ability to convert fat into brain fuel is the piece that permits everything else. There is one more place this appears, and it closes a loop opened earlier. Human infants run on ketones to a degree adults do not. Breast milk is rich in fat. An infant's brain is consuming an extraordinary share of the child's total energy, and measurements find newborns maintaining elevated ketone levels routinely in the first days and weeks of life, drawing on both the milk and the fat they were born carrying. The generous layer of fat on a human newborn, unusual among primates, is not merely insulation or ballast. It is raw material for a liver that will be converting it into brain fuel around the clock during the period of fastest brain growth any human being ever experiences. The reserve and the conversion pathway are two halves of one system, and both are present before the child has taken a single meal. The cost, as always, is not free. Ketone production is not gentle chemistry, and there is a condition in which it runs without restraint when the signal that normally limits the liver's output is missing entirely. Ketone concentrations can rise to levels that acidify the blood, which is a medical emergency and quite different from the mild, self-limiting levels produced by an ordinary night's fast. In a healthy body, the process is capped because the fat cells release their contents only as fast as the hormonal signals permit, and those signals respond to what is arriving through the gut. There is also acetone, the smallest of the three ketone bodies, which the body cannot use for much and largely exhales. Its faintly sweet smell on the breath of someone who has not eaten for a long stretch is the only part of this entire process that is directly detectable from outside, so the gap is now fully accounted for. A human being can go without food from one evening until the following afternoon, stay warm, stay strong, and stay mentally sharp, because a fat reserve is being translated by the liver into a fuel the brain will accept, and the price of doing so is charged against a store designed for exactly this, and not against muscle. The waiting is solved. What remains unsolved is the other half of the cycle, and it is the half that everything depends on. A reservoir has to be filled. A bear fills its reserve during an autumn when the forest is producing more food than it can eat, and it fills it by putting in almost the entire waking day for weeks. A human being filling the same kind of reserve is spending somewhere under an hour a day on the mouth, on food that arrives already dense and already broken open. That is the part still unexplained. A gorilla's leaves and a bear's berries and a chimpanzee's figs all require enormous time investments to yield their energy, because the work of unlocking that energy happens inside the animal, using the animal's own equipment and the animal's own hours. The human line abandoned that equipment and recovered those hours, and the food still gets unlocked. The work did not disappear. Work of that kind cannot simply be deleted from an energy budget. It has to be done by something, somewhere. There is an animal that shows what the bill looks like when a body insists on paying it internally. An animal that has arranged its entire existence around the fact that plant matter refuses to give up its energy without hours of grinding. And setting our schedule beside its schedule reveals where our hours actually went. A cow, standing in a field at 3 in the afternoon, is not resting. Watch the jaw, and it moves in a slow, rotary grind, sideways rather than up and down, at a rate of roughly 1 cycle per second, and it continues doing this for hours. Over a full day, a dairy cow spends something in the region of 8 hours actively chewing, split between the time spent taking grass in and the time spent bringing it back up to work on again. That second part is the essential one. What the animal swallows first is barely processed grass, torn off and passed down into a fermentation vat, held there while microbes go to work, then returned to the mouth in soft, compressed portions to be ground far finer than any first pass could manage, and swallowed once more. The word for that return portion is cud, and the reason for the whole operation is that the animal is trying to break open a molecule that no vertebrate enzyme can touch. The scale of the equipment involved is difficult to picture. The rumen of an adult cow holds well over 100 litres, in large animals considerably more, which means a substantial share of the animal's body volume is a single tank of fermenting plant matter maintained at a stable temperature and a stable acidity. Inside it, live bacteria, protozoa, and fungi in numbers that run to billions per milliliter. And the cow's actual food is not grass at all. It is the short-chain fatty acids those organisms release as they dismantle cellulose, absorbed through the rumen wall and burned. The animal is a walking container for a microbial workforce, and the terms of employment are strict. The tank must stay full, the acidity must stay within a narrow band, the chewing must continue in order to keep breaking material into pieces small enough for the microbes to attack, and the whole arrangement collapses if any of it stops. This is the same solution the gorilla uses, built larger and refined further, and it demonstrates the general rule with unusual clarity. An animal that insists on unlocking plant energy inside its own body pays for it in hours, in volume, and in the permanent obligation to keep feeding the tank. Set the human schedule beside that, and the contrast is not a difference of degree, under an hour a day at the mouth against 8. No fermentation vat against 150 litres, and yet the energy still arrives, in quantities sufficient to run the most expensive brain in the primate world. The work of breaking food down did not vanish, because that is not a thing energy budgets permit. It was moved. Everything that a rumen does inside a cow, and everything the extra chewing hours do inside a chimpanzee, our line began doing before the food ever reached the mouth. The first stage of that shift required nothing but stone. Cut marks on animal bones from sites in East Africa, including material from Gona and Buri in Ethiopia, dated to around 2.5 million years ago, show carcasses being opened with sharp edges, and the significance is mechanical rather than symbolic. A flake of stone does what a carnivore's teeth do, and our line has neither the teeth nor the jaws for it. Once meat can be sliced and pounded before eating, the chewing required to make it swallowable falls sharply. Experimental work by Daniel Lieberman and Catherine Zink at Harvard tested exactly this by measuring the muscular effort and the number of chews required to process food prepared in different ways, and they found that simply slicing meat and pounding root vegetables with stone tools produced substantial reductions in chewing effort on the order of a significant fraction of the total work, achieved with no heat involved at all. Mechanical processing alone begins the shift. The second stage did what stone could not. Heat applied to food does chemistry that a jaw cannot do at any speed. It gelatinizes starch, unwinding the tightly packed granules in tubers and grains so that digestive enzymes can reach them, and it denatures protein, unfolding the structures that otherwise resist being cut apart. The same study measured cooked material and found the reduction in chewing effort larger still. Beyond the mechanics, there is the question of yield. Richard Wrangham has argued for many years that the energy actually extracted from cooked food is meaningfully higher than from the same food raw, and work on this has found real differences, notably in starchy foods, where gelatinization makes a large share of the energy accessible that would otherwise pass through. The size of that advantage across the whole diet is debated, and researchers disagree about how much of the human digestive transformation heat can account for on its own. What is not seriously disputed is the direction. Processing food outside the body increases what the body can get out of it and reduces what the body must spend to get it. When that happened is a genuinely open question, and one of the more contested dates in the field. Evidence of controlled fire at Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa has been dated to roughly 1 million years ago, and there is material from Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel at around 800,000 years. Whether fire was in regular use substantially earlier than that, as some have argued on anatomical grounds, is not settled, because fire leaves poor traces, and the absence of evidence in old deposits is weak evidence of absence. The honest position is that the anatomy changed and the fire evidence firms up later, and the relationship between those two timelines is still being worked out. What the change did to the body, however, is written into the skeleton and does not depend on resolving the dates. The teeth got smaller, the jaws got shorter, the gut, as established earlier, came in at roughly 60% of the size predicted for a primate of our mass. Those reductions are not neutral adjustments, they are the removal of safety margin. A gorilla can eat badly for a season and survive on volume. Our line gave up that capacity, which is only a survivable thing to give up if the processing that replaces it is reliable, continuous, and never interrupted for more than a short period. This is the point where the human situation becomes genuinely unlike every other animal in this account. A cow can be dropped into a pasture and survive. A chimpanzee placed in a forest with fruit survives. A human being placed in the same forest with no tools and no fire is in serious difficulty, not because the calories are absent, but because they are locked inside material the body no longer has the equipment to open. Attempts to live on entirely raw diets in modern conditions, with access to cultivated high-quality produce and blenders, still tend to show difficulty maintaining body weight and, in women, disruption of reproductive function. A finding from a study of long-term raw food adherence in Germany that is frequently cited in this discussion. That result is striking precisely because those conditions are far more generous than anything available to a wild primate. The dependence is real, and it is total, and it is the least discussed cost in the entire arrangement. Something else follows from this that is easy to miss. Processing food outside the body is not something a lone animal does well. Fire has to be maintained, tools have to be made and remade, and the work of preparing food is separable from the work of getting it in a way that chewing never as a cow cannot delegate its chewing to another cow, but preparation can be done by someone who did not find the food, in a place away from where it was found, at a different time. The moment digestion moves outside the body, it becomes something that can be shared, divided, and specialized. The reduced gut and the small teeth are anatomical evidence of a change that was never purely anatomical. So the hours that went missing at the start of all this have been found. A chimpanzee spends 4 to 6 of them a day at the jaw, and a cow spends 8, and both are paying the same bill, the cost of unlocking energy from material that resists giving it up. Our line stopped paying that bill internally and started paying it externally, in stone edges and heat and preparation, and the difference is the free time. Not free in any absolute sense, since the preparation takes time of its own, but recovered from an organ and returned to a body that could then spend it on other things, including on running a brain that has grown far past the size any ape could otherwise afford, which leaves one loose end, and it concerns what the gut does with itself now. A cow's rumen is never idle. There is always material in it, and always fermentation underway. And the same is true, at smaller scale, of every continuous feeder in this account. A human gut spends a large part of each day genuinely empty. No food arriving, nothing left in transit, a tube of muscle and mucosa with nothing to move. An idle organ is a strange thing to build into a body, and it raises a question that sounds trivial and is not. What is a digestive system doing during the hours it has nothing to digest? There is an animal for which that question has a stark answer, because its gut is never permitted to be empty even briefly, and when it is, the animal can die from it. Setting that emergency against what happens inside a human being during the same empty hours reveals something almost no one knows about their own body, and the strangest part is that most people have heard the sound it makes and misunderstood what it was. A horse standing in a paddock overnight with nothing in front of it is in more trouble than it looks. The animal is built around a digestive tract that expects to be receiving small quantities almost continuously, and the reason begins at the front and ends somewhere unexpected. A horse takes in grass in a near constant trickle, grazing for something in the region of 16 hours a day when given the chance, in many short bouts spread through both light and dark. What it swallows goes first into a stomach that is remarkably small for the size of the animal. A horse weighing 500 kilograms carries a stomach holding somewhere around 15 liters, which is modest against a cow's rumen at 10 times that volume. The fermentation happens further along, in an enlarged cecum and colon behind the small intestine rather than in a chamber in front of it, and this single architectural difference shapes everything about how the animal must live. Putting the fermentation vat at the back end has a consequence the cow does not face. A cow ferments first and digests afterward, which means it can absorb the microbial products and then run its own enzymes over what the microbes leave behind. A horse does it in the opposite order, so whatever its microbes produce comes out at a point where much of the absorbing surface is already behind it. The system works, but it works on volume and continuity rather than on thoroughness, and it depends on material arriving steadily to keep the whole column moving. There is also a piece of equipment a horse simply does not have. The junction where the esophagus meets the stomach is closed by a muscular arrangement so strong and angled in such a way that a horse effectively cannot vomit. Whatever goes in continues forward, or it does not move at all, and there is no reverse. Put those together and the failure mode becomes clear. When a horse's gut slows or stops from a sudden change in feed, from dehydration, from a twist in the intestine, from a long unbroken gap without forage, the material inside has nowhere to go. Gas builds behind the blockage, the gut distends, and the animal has no route to relieve it. Colic covers a range of conditions rather than one disease, and severity varies enormously, but the underlying vulnerability is consistent. This is an animal whose survival depends on continuous forward motion through a very long tube in a body that cannot expel anything backwards. Owners are told to keep forage available and to avoid long empty stretches, and the reason is not nutritional in the ordinary sense. It is mechanical. An empty horse gut is a gut at risk of stopping, and a stopped horse gut is an emergency. Now hold your own gut against that, because during the hours you have not eaten, something is happening inside you that a horse can never afford. Roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours after the small intestine finishes clearing a meal, a distinct pattern of activity begins. It starts in the stomach, or the upper small intestine, as a period of quiet, builds into irregular contractions, and then, for a stretch of perhaps 5 to 10 minutes, produces a series of powerful sustained contractions that sweep down the length of the small intestine from one end toward the other. When the wave reaches the far end, it dies out, and the whole cycle restarts higher up. It repeats every hour and a half or 2 hours for as long as the gut remains empty. Researchers named it the migrating motor complex, and the description that stuck to it in the literature is the housekeeper. The purpose is exactly what that name suggests. Digestion leaves residue, indigestible fragments, sloughed cells from the lining, mucus, bacteria that have drifted upward from the colon into territory where they do not belong. The ordinary contractions that mix and move food are not designed to clear that material. They churn and propel gently, and they leave the walls populated. The housekeeping wave does something different. It is a scouring pass, strong and unidirectional, that pushes accumulated debris and displaced bacteria down and out of the small intestine toward the colon, and it is accompanied by increased secretion, gastric acid, bile, pancreatic fluid released into an empty tube where it functions as a rinse rather than as a digestive aid. The critical detail is that the pattern only runs on an empty system. Food arriving abolishes it immediately. The moment a meal enters, the wave is switched off, and the gut reverts to the mixing pattern of digestion, and the housekeeping cycle does not resume until the system has cleared again. This means that the emptiness is not a pause between periods of function. It is itself a period of function, running a maintenance program that cannot run at any other time. The human small intestine, which carries relatively few bacteria compared with the colon, appears to stay that way, in part because of this repeated flushing. Where the housekeeping wave is impaired, and there are conditions in which it is bacterial populations in the small intestine can climb, which is one of the mechanisms researchers have proposed to explain the discomfort that follows. The evidence around this is still being worked out, and the picture is not simple, but the basic relationship is well established. A gut that is regularly emptied gets cleaned, and a gut that is never emptied does not. The sound is the part almost everyone has experienced, and nearly everyone misreads. The rumbling that comes from an empty abdomen, the medical term is borborygmi, is not the stomach demanding food. It is the sound of gas and residual fluid being driven along a tube that has nothing solid in it to muffle the noise. The same contractions happen after a meal and make far less sound because the tube is full. What people interpret as a signal of hunger is largely the housekeeping wave in progress, audible precisely because there is nothing left inside to dampen it. The body is not asking. It is cleaning, and the noise is the cleaning being overheard. There is a hormonal layer beneath this that ties it back to the rest of the account. The wave is associated with rising levels of motilin, released from the upper small intestine during fasting, and with ghrelin, which comes largely from the stomach lining and increases during empty periods. Ghrelin is usually described as a hunger hormone, and it does drive appetite, but it also stimulates gut motility, and its pattern of release follows a rhythm. It climbs in the hours before habitual meal times and falls after eating. That rhythm is learned rather than fixed. A body that eats 3 times a day builds a ghrelin pattern with 3 peaks, and a body on a different schedule builds a different one. The sensation of being hungry at a particular hour is therefore partly a prediction the body has made about when food will arrive, layered on top of the mechanical cleaning process that is happening regardless. The costs here are subtle rather than dramatic. The housekeeping wave requires genuinely empty intervals to run, which means the arrangement assumes a feeding pattern with real gaps in it, and it is worth noticing that this assumption is the same one every other element in this account has been built on. There is also the matter of the acid and enzymes released into an empty tube. That is a system running its own aggressive chemistry against its own lining, with no food present to buffer it, protected only by mucus and by the speed at which the lining replaces itself. And there is a straightforward vulnerability in the design. A small intestine kept clean by flushing is a small intestine that depends on the flushing continuing. So the emptiness turns out to have been given a job. Every element assembled across this account produced a body that spends long stretches with nothing in transit, and rather than leaving those stretches idle, the gut uses them, running a cleaning cycle that a horse, which cannot afford an empty moment, has no opportunity to run at all. The horse pays for its fermentation strategy with a tract that must never stop. The human tract stops constantly and has built something into the stopping, which leaves an assumption that has been quietly accepted for several axes now and deserves examining. The argument so far has leaned on body size as the thing that made waiting possible. Mass buys fasting endurance. Small bodies cannot store enough, and the human capacity to go hours without eating followed from being large. A horse weighing 500 kilograms is a great deal larger than a human being and cannot go a night without forage. That already complicates the picture. And there is an animal considerably larger still, the largest on land, which spends nearly every waking hour with food in its mouth and has no choice in the matter. Its existence means that size, on its own, was never the answer. Something else determines whether a body is permitted to wait, and the elephant makes that other factor impossible to ignore. Whatever you last ate occupied very little space. A plate of food weighs a few hundred grams, perhaps a kilogram if the meal was a large one, and it fit comfortably inside an organ that at rest is smaller than a fist. That small quantity is expected to run a body of 60 or 70 kilograms for the better part of a day, to hold its temperature, to move it, to keep an unusually expensive brain supplied without interruption. Nothing about that seems remarkable until it is set against an animal that has to solve the same equation without the same advantage, and the largest land animal alive solves it in a way that ought to end the idea that size is what bought our freedom. An adult African savanna elephant weighs somewhere between 4 and 6 tons, and it spends roughly 16 to 18 hours of every day feeding, not searching for food, not traveling between patches feeding, with vegetation in the mouth and molars grinding. It takes in something in the region of 150 kilograms of plant material a day, drinks in the range of 100 to 200 liters of water, and sleeps remarkably little, with observations of wild elephants in Botswana finding as little as 2 hours in a 24-hour cycle, sometimes taken standing. An animal roughly 70 times your mass has substantially less freedom from food than you do, and the gap is not close. The reason lies in a piece of arithmetic that has been running underneath this entire question without being stated plainly. Every animal has to satisfy a daily energy requirement, and the hours it must spend at the mouth are that requirement divided by how much energy an hour of feeding actually delivers. Body size pushes the top of that fraction up, because absolute daily needs rise with mass even though the cost per gram falls. Food quality pushes the bottom of it up, because dense material delivers more per hour of chewing. Freedom appears only when the bottom grows faster than the top, and for an elephant it never does. Grass and browse and bark carry very little energy per unit of weight, and there is no way to acquire and grind 150 kilograms of it quickly. The constraint is not metabolic at all. It is a throughput problem at the mouth, and no amount of additional body mass has ever relieved it. What large size does buy is something different, and it is worth being precise about. because the distinction is the whole point. Ecologists working on African herbivores in the 1970s described a pattern now usually associated with the names Jarman and Bell. Larger herbivores can survive on lower quality forage than smaller ones because their energy needs per gram of body weight are lower and their gut capacity is proportionally greater, allowing material to be held longer and worked harder. Small antelope must select carefully, picking out buds and shoots and young leaves. An elephant can eat almost anything green and much that is not green, including bark torn from trunks and roots dug out with the tusks. Size purchased tolerance of bad food. It did not purchase time, and the elephant spent its inheritance on volume rather than on hours. The extraction itself is startlingly incomplete. Elephants are hindgut fermenters like the horse, working their material in an enlarged cecum and colon behind the small intestine, and researchers estimate that they digest only something in the region of 40 to 50% of what passes through them. Material moves through relatively quickly for an animal that size, and a great deal of it emerges recognizable intact fiber, whole seeds, fragments still identifiable as the plant they came from. That inefficiency is so pronounced that other animals feed on elephant dung, and seeds that survive the passage germinate in it, which has made elephants some of the most significant seed dispersers in the ecosystems they occupy. The strategy is not thoroughness, it is throughput. Push an enormous quantity through, take the accessible half, and let the rest go. A cow makes the opposite bargain, holding less material far longer and extracting more of it. Both strategies work, and both are paid for in the same currency, which is time at the jaw. Look at what that commitment does to the animal over a lifetime, because this is where the cost becomes almost unbearable to consider. An elephant's molars are enormous, ridge slabs, and they do not erupt vertically the way yours did. They move forward along the jaw from behind, one set at a time, like plates on a conveyor. As a set wears down under the grinding of silica-rich grass, it is pushed forward and shed at the front, and the next set advances into position. There are 6 sets, and no more. When the 6th is worn out, typically somewhere around 60 to 70 years of age, the animal can no longer reduce its food to a state it can process, and it declines and dies with abundant vegetation standing all around it. The lifespan of the largest land mammal is bounded by the durability of its teeth, which is another way of saying that it is bounded by its commitment to unlocking energy inside its own body. Now hold a human mouth next to that. A person loses teeth and continues living. A person loses all of them and is adequately nourished because the food arriving at that mouth has already been reduced, softened, heated, and broken open elsewhere, and the mouth has become close to optional in the process. Human beings routinely outlive the functional life of their own dentition by decades, which is not something the elephant's design permits under any circumstances. The equipment that kills an elephant when it fails is equipment our line stopped depending on. That comparison settles the question left open several axes back. The claim that body mass made waiting possible was true only in the narrow sense that it removed a lower limit. A shrew or a mouse cannot store enough fuel to bridge any meaningful gap, and no strategy rescues a body that small. Above that threshold, mass explains nothing. A horse at 500 kilograms cannot go a night without forage. An elephant at 5 tons cannot go an afternoon. The variable that actually determines whether a body is permitted to wait is the energy density of what enters the mouth, and every increase in density buys back hours directly. Meat is denser than leaves. Marrow and fat are denser than meat. Cooked starch releases far more of what it holds than raw starch does. The processing described earlier, the stone edges, the pounding, the heat, was not simply a way of reducing chewing effort. It was a way of raising the energy delivered per hour spent, and once that figure climbs high enough, the hours collapse to almost nothing. The elephant sits at the far end of the same scale, working with material so dilute that no amount of size or patience can shorten its day. There is a cost written into this that is harder to name than the others, and it deserves to be stated carefully. Every mechanism in this account developed under a single persistent condition: that acquiring dense food was difficult, uncertain, and worth almost any effort. The body's machinery for finding it, wanting it, and storing it was shaped against that difficulty. And there is no equivalent machinery shaped against the opposite problem, because the opposite problem did not exist for the overwhelming majority of the time this body was being assembled. What happens when density becomes effortless and continuous is a large question. The evidence around it is complicated, and it involves far more than the biology described here, so it would be dishonest to compress it into a neat conclusion. What can be said without overreaching is narrower and still worth sitting with. The freedom to ignore food for hours and the vulnerability to food that never stops arriving are the same adaptation, seen from two different environments. There is also a dependence buried in the arithmetic itself. An elephant, for all the misery of its schedule, has an enormous margin. Its food is everywhere, and if the quality falls, it simply eats more. Our line took the opposite position. The human day works only because what arrives at the mouth is dense, and there is no fallback available, because the equipment for extracting energy from dilute material was surrendered generations ago, and no amount of additional eating time can substitute for it. The elephant's problem is that it can never stop. Ours is that we cannot compensate. So the accounting is nearly complete, and every animal in it has taken one of two approaches to the gap between meals. Some close the gap by never allowing it to open, feeding continuously through the light hours or through most of the day, paying in time. Others allow the gap and cover it internally, filling a reserve during good periods and drawing it down during the empty ones, paying in the weight of what they carry and in the machinery required to convert it. Both approaches share an assumption so basic that it has gone unexamined, that the body must go on running at full temperature and full speed throughout the gap, and that the only question is where the fuel comes from. There is a third solution, and it discards the assumption entirely. Rather than finding fuel to cover the empty hours, some animals simply stop being animals that require it, letting the internal temperature fall away, letting the metabolism drop toward the temperature of the air, and passing through the gap in a state that is closer to suspension than to sleep. Among the creatures that do this is one with the most impossible energy budget of any warm-blooded animal alive, which feeds every 10 or 15 minutes through the entire day and then faces a night that, by every calculation, it should not survive. Understanding how it gets through that night reveals what our own line gave up by refusing to take the same exit. And the thing we refuse to switch off is the organ. This whole account has been circling from the beginning. Your temperature is falling at this moment, and it is falling by almost nothing. Through the night, the human core drifts down toward a low point in the early hours, and the size of that drift is somewhere near 1/2 degree. In some people approaching a full degree, before it begins climbing again, shortly before waking. That is the entire concession a human body makes to a night without food. everything stays on. The heart slows a little, breathing settles, muscle tone drops away, and underneath all of it, the furnace continues burning at very nearly the rate it burned at noon, holding an internal environment steady against a cooler room for 8 or 9 hours on nothing arriving from outside. It is worth asking why a body would insist on that, because there is another way through the night, and it is used by animals with far less margin than we have. The most extreme practitioner of that other way weighs about as much as 2 paper clips. A ruby-throated hummingbird carries roughly 3 grams of body mass, and a bee hummingbird considerably less, and inside that mass sits the highest sustained metabolic rate of any warm-blooded animal on Earth. Its heart runs to something above 1,200 beats a minute during flight, its wings beat somewhere around 50 times a second, and it breathes at a rate that makes the individual breaths impossible to distinguish. The energy required to hold a body in hovering flight is enormous, because a hovering animal generates all of its lift from scratch with no forward motion to help, and the bird pays for it by feeding constantly. It visits flowers through the entire light half of the day, returning every 10 or 15 minutes, taking nectar that is mostly water, carrying a load of sugar. There is a detail in how it uses that sugar that has no real parallel elsewhere. Most animals digest a meal, store the products, and later withdraw from storage to fuel activity. A hummingbird can burn nectar sugar almost directly, with researchers finding that fuel taken in during a feeding bout is powering the flight muscles within a remarkably short window, so that a large share of the energy driving the wings at any moment came from a flower visited minutes earlier. The bird has largely dispensed with the reservoir in the middle. It is running on immediate income, which works beautifully as long as the flowers are open, and catastrophically the moment they are not. Then the sun goes down. A hummingbird at the end of a day carries fat reserves that, against its rate of burning, would not survive the night. The arithmetic is not close. An animal that small, holding a temperature near 40 degrees, with a surface enormous relative to its volume, and a metabolism running at that speed, would exhaust everything it has long before morning, and the fact that hummingbirds exist means something must intervene. What intervenes is that the bird stops being a warm animal. It enters torpor, and torpor is not sleep. The bird grips a branch, the feathers fluff, and the internal thermostat is effectively abandoned. Body temperature falls away toward the temperature of the surrounding air, in temperate species dropping into the teens, and in high-altitude Andean species, researchers have recorded core temperatures down near 3 to 5 degrees, colder than a refrigerator. The heart, which was running above 1,000 beats a minute in flight, falls to something near 50. Oxygen consumption drops to a small fraction of the resting rate, by many measurements to a 20th or less. The bird becomes cold, rigid, and unresponsive, and, if lifted from its perch, it may not react at all. It is not resting through the night. It has switched itself off and is waiting out the gap in a state much closer to suspension than to sleep, and when light returns, it shivers itself back up to operating temperature over a period of perhaps 20 minutes before it can fly. That is the third solution to the problem this whole account has been circling. Some animals close the gap by never letting it open, feeding continuously and paying in hours. Others let the gap open and cover it from a reserve, paying in stored weight and in the machinery to convert it. The hummingbird does neither. It abolishes the requirement itself, on the grounds that a body which is barely running needs barely anything, and this exit is used far more widely than most people realize by bats, by small marsupials, by mice and shrews under cold stress, by a great many small birds on cold nights. Almost anything small and warm-blooded has some version of it available. Our line does not, and there are two separate reasons why, which sit on top of each other. The first is the geometry from earlier, running in reverse. A small body cools quickly, which is what makes it vulnerable in the first place, and that same rapid cooling is what makes torpor practical. A hummingbird can shed its heat in minutes and shiver it back in 20. A body of 70 kilograms cools slowly and rewarms far more slowly still, and the cost of rewarming rises with the mass being heated. For a large animal, dropping deeply and coming back up would take hours in each direction and consume a substantial share of whatever the maneuver was meant to save. The bear, which is the largest mammal to attempt anything like this, does not drop far. It holds 30 degrees or better, precisely because a body that size cannot afford to go lower and return. Size close the exit. The same mass that made waiting survivable made switching off impossible, which means the two walls face in opposite directions, and our line is standing between them, too large to turn off, and, without the reservoir, too demanding to stay on. The second reason is more specific, and it concerns the organ that has been at the center of this from the beginning. When a hibernating mammal cools, its brain does not simply pause and resume unchanged. Work on ground squirrels has found that during deep torpor the branching structures of neurons retract substantially, with dendrites simplifying and synaptic connections lost, and that these are rebuilt within a couple of hours of the animal warming back up. The rebuilding is fast and apparently effective, which is remarkable in itself, but the underlying picture is that the cold brain is a dismantled brain and that arousal involves reassembling it. Studies looking at what survives the process have found evidence that memories formed before hibernation can be impaired afterward, with retention appearing to depend on how long and how deeply the animal was cold. The evidence here is still developing and the details are argued over, so it would be wrong to state the case more strongly than that. What can be said is that the cheapest thing to shut down in a torpid animal is the thing our line was investing everything in, and that a species whose entire strategy rests on an expensive, continuously trained nervous system has an unusually poor reason to take an exit that requires taking that system apart every night. Sleep, in a human being, is the opposite arrangement. Measurements of brain metabolism during sleep find glucose use falling meaningfully in the deepest slow-wave stages, but nothing resembling shutdown, and during the dreaming stages, the brain's energy consumption returns to something close to waking levels, and by some measures exceeds them. The organ is not resting. It is running processes it cannot run while occupied, consolidating what was learned, clearing metabolic products in ways still being worked out, reorganizing itself for the following day, and every hour of that is paid for from a reserve, translated by the liver, delivered as ketones and glucose to an organ that has never once in your life been permitted to go cold. That is what the whole apparatus was for. The fat carried at a proportion no other primate matches, the liver that converts it into a currency the brain will accept, the body mass that makes the reserve last, the stomach built to take on dense loads, the gut that gave up its slow chamber, the mouth that gave up its hours. Every piece of it exists to fund one refusal. Other animals faced the same gap and either filled it or slept through it in the only way a small body can, by ceasing for a while to be an animal that requires anything. Our line covered it, at considerable expense, in order to keep a single organ running at full temperature and full attention through every empty hour of every night. There is a cost in this that is rarely counted, and it is the loss of an escape route. A hummingbird facing a bad night has a lever to pull. A mouse facing a cold snap and an empty stomach can drop into torpor and wait. A human being facing a genuine shortage has no such lever. The reserve can be drawn down, and that is the whole of it. And when the reserve is gone, the body begins consuming itself, while the brain, which cannot be switched off, continues demanding its share to the end. The commitment is total, and it has no reverse setting, which leaves one last piece of the arrangement unexamined, and it concerns what all this continuous readiness costs when nothing is happening at all. The brain runs constantly, and that has been accounted for, but the digestive system also stays fully built and fully maintained, through every empty hour, the lining replacing itself, the secretions ready, the whole tract idling in a state of preparedness for a meal that may be many hours away. That is a standing expense paid for a capability not currently in use, and it is not obvious that it should be paid. There is an animal that refuses to pay it, and its refusal is one of the strangest things in vertebrate physiology. Between meals, it allows its own digestive organs to shrink away to a fraction of their working size, and rebuilds them from almost nothing when food finally arrives. What that animal saves by doing so, and why our line pays the bill instead, exposes the last hidden term in the human relationship with food. Nothing is passing through your small intestine at this hour, and the organ is being maintained anyway. The lining is replacing itself on a schedule that does not pause for the absence of food. The cells covering the surface of the intestine turn over every few days, one of the fastest replacement rates anywhere in the body, which means that during the empty hours, a substantial construction project is running inside a tube with nothing in it. The blood supply stays connected. The mucus keeps being secreted. The muscle layers keep their tone and run their housekeeping waves. Considered coldly, this is an odd thing to pay for. The digestive tract is expensive tissue in the same metabolic league as brain and heart and kidney, and here it is drawing on the reserve while performing no digestion at all, held in readiness for a meal that might arrive in an hour or might arrive tomorrow. It is a standing charge for a capability not currently in use, and there is an animal that looked at that charge and declined it. A Burmese python spends most of its life not eating. Large individuals in the wild may take a substantial meal and then go weeks or months before the next one, and in some cases considerably longer, and what happens to the animal's body during those intervals is difficult to believe on first hearing. The digestive organs are largely dismantled. Research on fasting pythons has found the small intestine reduced dramatically, with the absorptive surface flattened and the intestinal mass falling to a fraction of its working size, and reductions extending to the liver, the kidneys, the pancreas, and the heart. The organs are not merely quiet, they are physically taken apart and their materials recovered, leaving the animal with an interior stripped down to something close to a minimum, and the payoff is that the standing charge nearly disappears. A fasting python's metabolic rate falls to a remarkably low level, so low that the animal can lie coiled and unmoving for months on a fuel expenditure that would barely register in a mammal of similar mass. Then something arrives. When a python swallows prey, and it swallows prey that can approach or exceed a quarter of its own body weight, sometimes more, the dismantled machinery has to be rebuilt before digestion can proceed, and the rebuilding is one of the most extreme physiological events measured in any vertebrate. Within a day or two of the meal, the intestinal lining regenerates, the surface structures grow back, and the organ mass climbs steeply. The liver enlarges substantially. The heart itself increases in mass within days, a genuine growth of cardiac muscle, because the reconstruction and the digestion together demand a circulation the fasting animal did not need. All of this costs energy, and the cost is visible in the animal's oxygen consumption, which rises by something in the region of a 40-fold increase over the resting rate at the peak of the process, a figure comparable to what a mammal reaches during hard exercise, produced by a snake lying entirely still in the dark. The elevated state persists for days while the meal is processed. Then everything reverses, and the organs are taken down again. The animal is not simply eating. It is assembling a digestive system, using it, and disassembling it once per meal. That is a coherent strategy, and its logic is worth stating plainly, because it clarifies what the alternative is buying. A python pays almost nothing between meals and pays enormously at each meal. The arrangement makes sense when meals are rare, unpredictable, and large, because under those conditions, the standing charge accumulated across months of waiting would exceed the cost of rebuilding a few times a year. It also depends on a body that can afford to be helpless during the rebuild, and on a nervous system that does not require anything in particular during the months of waiting. A python between meals is not doing much thinking. The strategy purchases a low-standing charge at the price of readiness, and readiness is exactly what our line could not surrender. A human digestive system that shut down between meals would need hours or days to come back, and the food would be gone by then. The human pattern is dense meals at intervals of hours, not sparse meals at intervals of months, which means the tract has to be usable at any moment, and the only way to have it usable at any moment is to keep it built and keep paying for it. What that costs is not a rounding error. The digestive tract, kept fully assembled and maintained, is one of the largest standing expenses in the body, and it is paid every hour whether food is arriving or not. This is where the whole account can be added up honestly, because the human arrangement has now been described in full, and it is not free at any point. The gut was reduced to roughly 60% of the size predicted for a primate of our mass, which removed the capacity to survive on poor material and made dense, processed food a requirement rather than a preference. The chewing apparatus shrank, leaving jaws that no longer reliably accommodate the teeth they carry. The fat reserve that covers the gap is generous, and its filling machinery is far more eager than its emptying machinery, an asymmetry that was an advantage in a world where dense food was hard to find. The stomach acid strong enough to serve as a barrier is strong enough to damage the wall containing it if the defenses falter. The brain that all of this exists to fund cannot be switched off, cannot be cooled, and has no reserve of its own beyond a few hours of liver glycogen and whatever the liver can convert from fat. And underneath every one of those, the tract itself sits fully staffed through the empty hours, ready for a meal that has not arrived. The freedom to ignore food for most of the day is real, and it is one of the most unusual capacities any animal has. It was purchased by giving up nearly every fallback that other animals rely on, and the bill is paid continuously, in the background, by a body that has arranged itself around the assumption that something dense will arrive before the reserve is spent. That accounting closes the biology. What it does not close is the question the whole thing started from, and the gap is worth naming precisely. Everything described so far explains how a human body survives the hours between meals. It does not explain how a human body knows there will be another meal. A python does not need to know. It eats when prey happens by, and its physiology handles the rest. A gorilla does not need to know. The leaves are always there. But a body that has surrendered its fallbacks, that depends on dense food arriving before its reserve runs out, and that cannot enter torpor. If the food fails to arrive, that body is making a bet every single time it lets its stomach empty. The bet is that the gap will end. Something has to be underwriting that confidence, and it cannot be anything in the digestive system, because the digestive system is precisely what was given away. There is a creature that solved the same problem from an entirely different direction, one that has nothing to do with reserves inside the body at all. It stores energy outside itself, in a structure it builds, in quantities far beyond what any individual could carry, and it does so on behalf of a population rather than an individual. It also does something stranger. It tells the others where the food is. The relationship between storing energy outside the body, sharing it, and being able to plan for a gap is the last thread in this, and following it back leads to the organ that has been the answer from the beginning. There is a hive somewhere in a hollow tree tonight, holding 20 or 30 kilograms of honey, and no individual inside it could carry more than about 70 milligrams of anything. That ratio is the entire idea. A honeybee weighs roughly 1/10 of a gram and lives on sugar with almost no margin at all. A foraging bee separated from food will exhaust its available fuel within hours, sometimes within a single hour of flight, because a flying insect burns at a rate that leaves nothing in reserve. Measured as an individual, a bee has less capacity to weight than almost any animal in this account. It has no fat store worth the name, no liver-converting reserves into an alternative fuel, no mass to slow its burning. By every principle established so far, that animal should be locked into continuous feeding more tightly than a hummingbird. And yet a colony of them survives a northern winter, months of cold with no flowers anywhere, without a single bee leaving to forage. The solution is that the reserve is not inside any of them. It is in the comb, built from wax the bees secrete, filled with nectar they have reduced by evaporation until the water content is low enough that it will not ferment, then capped and sealed. Honey stored that way keeps for years. What the colony has done is take the function that a bear performs with body fat and move it outside the body entirely, into a structure that can hold a quantity no organism of that size could ever carry, in a form that does not spoil and does not have to be maintained by living tissue. Through the winter, the bees cluster into a dense ball around the stores, and the ones toward the middle vibrate their flight muscles to generate heat, holding the core of the cluster warm while the bees rotate between the cold outside layer and the warm interior. They are running a furnace on a fuel supply that sits in the wall beside them, and the fuel was gathered by bees that are already dead. There is a second half to this that matters more than the storage. A bee that finds a rich patch of flowers returns to the hive and performs a movement on the vertical surface of the comb, a figure-8 run with a straight central segment, in which the angle of that segment relative to gravity corresponds to the direction of the food relative to the sun, and the duration of the run corresponds roughly to the distance. Other bees follow the dance, and then fly out toward a place they have never seen. The work of Carl von Frisch on this in the middle of the last century was contentious for decades, and the details are still being refined, but the central finding has held up. Information about the location of food is being transferred from one animal to another, and the recipients act on it. This means the colony's foraging is not the sum of individual searching. It is coordinated by shared information, which lets a few thousand bees exploit a landscape far larger than any of them could survey alone. Storage outside the body and information passed between individuals turn out to be two halves of one solution, and neither works nearly as well without the other. Now put a human being in that frame, because this is where every thread in this account converges. Our line did all three things at once. It stores internally, in a fat reserve larger in proportion than any other primate carries, converted by the liver into a fuel the brain accepts. It stores externally, in the sense that food is gathered, processed, and kept in a form and a place separate from any individual body, which is the same trick as honey and comb, and it is possible for the same reason because the work of unlocking energy was moved outside the body, and once it is outside, it can be done ahead of time. And it coordinates through shared information, which is the part that changes everything else. A stone edge is not just a tool, it is a technique that had to be learned from someone. Fire has to be maintained by more than one pair of hands, and its uses have to be taught. The knowledge of which roots repay digging, where water stands in a dry season, when a particular tree fruits, none of that is carried in the body, and all of it is the difference between a gap that ends and a gap that does not. There is a specific piece of physiology that shows how deeply this expectation is written into the body, and it runs constantly without ever being noticed. When a person sees food, smells it, or in some circumstances merely thinks about it with enough attention, the body begins preparing before anything is eaten. The stomach increases acid secretion, saliva production rises, the pancreas releases insulin in advance of any glucose arriving in the blood. Researchers call this the cephalic phase response, and the essential thing about it is the direction of causation. The digestive system is being switched on by the nervous system on the basis of a prediction ahead of the event, sometimes well ahead. The gut is not responding to food. It is responding to the anticipation of food, and the anticipation is generated by an organ that has learned what usually happens next. Every part of the arrangement described across this account depends on that prediction being roughly correct. The reserve is allowed to be drawn down because it will be refilled. The stomach is allowed to be empty because it will be loaded. The gut that gave up its fermentation chamber is viable only because dense food keeps arriving, and the reason it keeps arriving is that something in the animal is planning for it, remembering where it was found, and telling others. The organ that funds the whole system is the same organ the whole system was built to fund. That is the shape of the answer. Most animals eat all day because their bodies must do the work of unlocking energy internally, and that work takes hours, no matter how the animal is arranged. A cow chewing for 8, an elephant feeding for 16, a chimpanzee grinding fruit for 5. Our line stopped doing that work internally and started doing it outside the body, which returned an enormous quantity of time and reduced the equipment needed to almost nothing. The energy freed by that reduction went, at least in substantial part, into a brain that could plan, remember, and share. And that brain is precisely what makes it safe to walk around with an empty stomach, because it holds a model of a world in which the next meal exists. We do not eat all day because we do not have to, and we do not have to because we can think about food that is not here yet. The cost, honestly stated, is that the arrangement has no fallback at any level. The gut cannot handle poor material. The body cannot shut itself down and wait out a shortage. The reserve is generous, but finite, and the brain that has to be kept running is the least interruptible organ in the body. Every fallback that other animals rely on, the fermentation chamber, the torpor, the ability to dismantle the digestive system and rebuild it later, the option of simply eating more of something worthless was traded away, and what was received in exchange was time and a brain to spend it with. It is a strong position and a narrow one, and it has held for a very long time. there is something worth taking from this beyond the biology. The empty hours in a human day are not a deficit or a failure of the body to keep itself supplied. They are the condition the body was built around, the state in which its cleaning runs, its reserves are drawn on as designed, and its most expensive organ continues working without interruption on fuel prepared for exactly this purpose. That emptiness is what all of it was for, and it exists only because, somewhere far back, this animal stopped spending its days on the work of digestion and started spending them on everything else, which is to say that most of what a human life consists of happens in hours that a chimpanzee would have spent chewing. The strangest part is what that implies about the relationship itself. Every other animal in this account relates to food as a physical problem to be solved by physical means: more chewing, a larger chamber, a deeper reserve, a colder night. Ours is the only one that solved it partly by knowing something. A body that can wait is a body that expects, and expecting is not a property of tissue. So the question the whole thing began with turns out to have a strange ending. The reason you can go from one evening to the following afternoon without eating is not really that your fat reserve is large, or your gut is efficient, or your liver can convert one fuel into another, though all of that is true and necessary. It is that some part of you is confident the gap will close. That confidence was assembled over an enormous stretch of time by an animal that learned to prepare its food, to keep it, and to tell others where more could be found. And it now sits so deep in the body that the stomach begins working on a meal that has not been made yet, which leaves one thing unresolved, and it may not have an answer. Every other creature in this account is doing something with its day that its body requires. The bee returns to the comb, the cow returns to the cud, the elephant returns to the grass. Our line was handed back the hours, and the hours have to go somewhere. What a body does with time it no longer owes to its own digestion is not a biological question anymore, and yet it is the one the whole arrangement was built to make possible. What, in the end, were all those hours for?